안녕하세요. 저는 여기 워싱턴 DC에서 열리고 있는 IMF 세계은행 총회에 와 있습니다. IMF에서 아시아 태평양 지역을 담당하고 있는 크리슈나 스리니바산 국장을 만날 예정인데요. 한국에 관해서 여러 가지 질문들을 드려볼 계획입니다. 같이 하시죠.
The South Korean economy is quite highly dependent on export. As Mr. Helbling said yesterday, the Korean economy might contract relatively if the trade tensions escalate. On the other hand, there are some opinions that as the distance between the United States and China increases, it might give some advantages for some Korean companies such as shipbuildings or batteries. Do you have any kind of opinion about that?
Now, as you know, global supply chains have been diversifying for some time now, not just because of the pandemic, but goes beyond before that in response to the US-China trade frictions. So this is happening. So what we have done an analysis to see what has been the impact of these kind of trade tensions on trade by Asian countries. And what we find is that the share of imports from China and US of Asian countries has been rising, which tells you, and both in gross terms and in value-added terms, that just tells you that many Asian countries are now acting as connector countries, including Korea. Now, what we also say is all this is for the short term. If you look at it from a long-term perspective, all countries lose. Why is that? Because when you have this kind of trade fragmentation, then global output contracts, all countries are hit. What we find in Asia, the country which is hurt the most will be China, because of course it's the reason why there's so much of fragmentation. I mean, both US and China, that's where the fragmentation is beginning. So China loses the most, and countries which have exposure to China, like the Korea of the world, they get hit that much more. So that's it. So in the long run, everybody loses. Some countries, some regions lose more. The region which loses a lot more is Asia. The countries which lose a lot are countries like China and Korea. Now, what we've seen recently also is that the Q3 numbers came out for Korea, and there the exports of technology products slowed down. And within that, there's differentiation. If you look at the high-end chip, Korea still does well. If you look at the lower-end chips, Korea doesn't fare so well. So there's an issue of how Korea adapts to that by improving the supply of high-tech chips. So that is the pluses and minuses of what's happening on trade.
Recently, Inter McGill, the chief economist of the World Bank, and he praised the growth of South Korean economy and mentioning it's like a superstar, which sounds really nice. However, there are significant concerns in South Korea society that the growth of South Korean economy will slow down afterwards from now on. So the South Korean media describes this kind of concern as peak Korea possibility. And do you have any kind of opinion about that?
That's a very good question. Let me say that in terms of macro fundamentals, South Korea stands out. Growth is pretty good. Inflation is coming down. You look at public debt levels, that's well within a reasonable range. So if you look at macro fundamentals, Korea is doing very well. Now, the question, of course, is, last year the growth was 1.4%. And in the first half of this year, growth was 2.7%. And because that was largely led by technology exports going up. Because of that, we marked up our forecast for 2024 to 2.5%. But then Q3 came out. Q3 is on the weaker side. So we are likely to, this Q3 being lower than expected means there's some downside to growth in Korea for 2024. For 2025, we have 2.2%. That's approximately the potential growth for Korea. So in other words, Korea, like any other advanced economies, will slow down in its growth, and so we're coming down to 2%. So the question is, what does Korea do going beyond that? How does Korea improve its potential growth? And there are many ways to do this. One is productivity is slowing in Korea. So anything it does to improve productivity will increase its potential growth. And what are the measures they can use to boost productivity? They can use new technology. AI is one, allowing you to make reskill your labor and boost productivity. That's one way. The other issue for Korea, it's a country where population is aging fast. So what Korea does to address its population aging, both in terms of pension reform, in terms of increasing participation of everyone, including women, all that will boost Korea's potential growth. So the answer to your question, Lucia, is that yes, Korea's growth is slowing, but it is slowing to its potential growth. And what Korea needs to do now is to do everything possible to raise its potential growth going forward. If you also want to increase potential growth, you can bring in foreigners, which is not a very popular theme right now, but in a globalized world, getting talent to come to Korea could also help boost its potential growth.
But it's going to be politically controversial.
Absolutely. In every country. I'm just giving you, as an economist, I can tell you all what can be done. At the end of the day, some of these issues are political economy issues the leadership will have to sort out.
The government debt ratio in South Korea has been steadily increasing, and I understand that you have issued several warnings about that, the rising debt ratio and the fiscal deficit of South Korean government. However, some in South Korea argue that the concerns are quite excessive, given that the fiscal soundness is quite not so really poor. Do you have any opinion about that?
So let's put this in a broader context. If you look at Asia, Asia is one region where public debt levels have been rising. Not just now, but from the global financial crisis. If you compare debt levels in Asia, say 2007 to now, they have risen a lot. In some countries, they have more than doubled. For example, in China, it's more than doubled. In Japan, it's gone beyond 250%. So if you compare these countries and you compare Korea, in Korea, the debt level is about 52%, which is not very high when you compare it with the peers in the region. However, Korea faces some problems. What are the problems? They have population which is aging. They have issues with respect to productivity declining. They have issues related to climate change. So when you take into account all the long-term costs, right, or long-term fiscal pressures, it's very important that Korea keeps a prudent fiscal stance. And that's why it's important to recognize that even though debt levels may not be very high at 52% of GDP, you have longer term pressures coming up, which makes it imperative to keep debt contained. And keeping it contained within 60% of GDP, and anchoring that through fiscal rule. In all this, this is an advice we give to many countries. That's very important to have a well-articulated fiscal rule which anchors your debt, which anchors a deficit. And that's why it's important for Korea to do something along those lines.
I'm pretty sure you're against to MMT. People, do you remember some people say that the government debt can be much, much higher than we thought before?
Spending is easy. Yeah. But raising revenue and cutting expenditures is very hard. So you don't want to do the first thing willy-nilly. You want to be very careful, not engage in fiscal profligacy. You're in a good situation. Try to keep that, especially given longer-term pressures.
And the ratio of household debt, I would like to mention it. The ratio of household debt to income in South Korea was like 155% in 10 years ago, 2013, but it exceeded 200% the year before in 2022. There are mixed opinions about the appropriateness of this level of debt. And I remember you advised earlier this year that the leverage in the household sector should be reduced. And what policies do you think the South Korean government should adopt to keep it sound?
Again, a good question. So let's put things in perspective. Yes, household debt in Korea is on the higher side compared to many parts of Asia. Clearly, that's the case if you compare Asia with other peers in the region and outside the region. However, you ask yourself this question, is this debt backed by financial assets? And the answer is yes, because even though household debt has gone up, it's all backed by good financial assets. The second issue here is people who have taken the debt are those who are earning well. So in other words, it's the really creditworthy people who have borrowed money and have bought houses and so on and so forth. So one, it's backed by assets, and these are creditworthy people. So in that sense, it reduces the risk that you have on the balance sheet. That said, anytime debt is at that higher level, you worry. As a policymaker, you worry, and you say, I need to make sure that it is well contained. So that is where it's important to think about macroprudential tools like loan to value, debt service to income, and so on. So these are measures which countries have used very well to gradually reduce the amount of household debt. You don't want to do that in a very abrupt way. So you want to put in place measures which will bring this down gradually.
Regarding the G20 finance ministers meeting, it happened last year, and you anticipated the South Korean's technological cycle would be on upward trend this year. And how would you evaluate the situation so far?
If you look at the first half of this year, after a few months, when I was in Korea, I said that the tech cycle is likely to pick up, and it did pick up. So in the first half of 2024, growth in Korea was 2.7%, and that was largely led by a pickup in technology exports. And at that, we had said that that's a good news. The not so good news is domestic demand is on the weaker side. Now look at Q3. The Q3 numbers have come out. The aggregate numbers are worse than what we expected, but there are two good news there. One is consumption, which was weak, is picking up. So domestic demand is picking up. But even technology exports, which have reduced quarter to quarter, but if you compare year on year, it is still at about more than 5%. So exports, technology exports remain sound. But within that, you have to think about some may do better than the others. For example, high-end chips, Korea is doing very well. Lower-end chips, Korea is not doing so well. Again, there's differentiation between the technology exports. And so there's not one picture, but my sense is given the emphasis, given the trends in the adoption of new technology like AI and so on, we will see a pickup in exports.
The Bank of Korea Governor Chang Yong-lee mentioned yesterday here that Korea might need to re-evaluate IT cycle. And I understood that he is saying that Korea's advantage decreases in competition with Chinese companies, so export may decline and potentially hindering the overall economic growth of South Korea. So do you agree with this kind of view?
This question of yours has two parts. One is the China part, the other is the Korea part, right? So the China part is that, China inflation is very low. Core inflation China came at 0.1%, headline inflation 0.4%. That's translated into lower export prices. And with the currency going the way it's going, export prices of China are coming down. That puts countries like Korea at a disadvantage because they're competing in the same market. So yes, there is going to be a spillover from what's happening in China to what happens to Korea's exports. That said, there are elements where China competes well with Korea, the lower end chips, right? There, China competes and takes away market share. At the higher end of the chip, Korea is still doing well. So Korea needs to really innovate. It needs to make sure that it remains ahead of the curve in the technology area, and so that it can compete better, not just with the low-cost producers like China, but also more high-end technology producers like Taiwan, province of China.
Can I ask your opinion about the recent pivot of Bank of Korea? They changed their monetary policy to downwards. Do you think is it too late, or was it appropriate time?
No, I actually disagree with you. I don't think it's too late, because when it comes to monetary policy decisions here, the Bank of Korea had to do a difficult job. It had to balance price stability versus financial stability. So even though prices were coming down, and if I'm not mistaken, now it's at target, and we expect average inflation in 2025 to be 2%, which is the Bank of Korea's target. So prices have been coming down, but if you cut interest rates, you could increase financial stability pressures, because of you could further propel the housing market. People take more leverage, and as it is, household debt is very high, so you have a financial stability risk. So from a risk management perspective, the Bank of Korea was straddling between these two objectives. But now that prices are coming down, and also house prices have also come down, that provides the right basis for the Bank of Korea to be having a more accommodative stance. But again, they have to be careful in doing this, because there are upside risks to price stability, because the external environment is very difficult, right? So given a difficult external environment, there are upside risks to price. So you have to be cautious. So in some sense, the Bank of Korea has done a very good job of straddling between these two objectives. But now that both inflation is coming down and house prices have been moderating, it's a good time to think about greater accommodation.
You're going to Tokyo soon, right?
Yes.
What are you going to deliver? What's your message going to be?
So we will be publishing our regional economic outlook, and there's a chapter which comes with that. It's an analytical chapter. It's look at structural transformation in Asia. In other words, how has Asian countries done from moving from agriculture to manufacturing to services? Now we all recognize that Asia has done very well in going towards the manufacturing part, right? Because of integration to global supply chains. But we also find that some Asian countries now have already moved towards greater services, and some will have to move towards greater services because with income levels rising, the amount in terms of manufacturing, that's running out. So it's more veering towards services sector.
Thank you so much, sir.